The last of the three great areas that we want to look at in the civil rights movement history post World War II is the movement for voting rights. Now, the movement for voting rights, we're going to look at two large arenas here. The movement really has two components. We forget about the Freedom Summer of Mississippi in 1964 in order to remember the Selma movement in Alabama in 1965. But let's go back and look at the origins of the voting rights movement just a little bit. In Georgia, here, a third state, in Georgia, a woman named Septima Clark, Septima, had created citizenship schools for African Americans to learn enough literacy, to learn how to be literate enough and to learn enough about the Constitution that they could pass the literacy tests and the understanding tests, that is, quote unquote, understanding tests, set up as roadblocks to registration to vote. Now, as African Americans got better and better at passing these tests, the tests got weirder and weirder. And anecdotally, we can find instances hither, thither, and yon about very well-educated African Americans who were unable to pass the understanding tests because the tests were not based on anything rational. But in general, let's look at the mass. Septima Clark schools in Georgia, which were really workshops, were modestly effective at least getting a few voters here and there registered to vote. Now, Bob Moses, who you see here, and who invariably wore a T-shirt and overalls in his work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and with the Confederation of Freedom Organizations, that is SNCC and COFO, had been working since 1961-62 to register African Americans to vote in Mississippi. And boy, people think that Birmingham was the hard city. It was the center of segregationism, but Mississippi was the hard state. And Moses, who also doesn't receive the amount of historical interest as he probably should, then took the fight for voting rights to the doorstep of the hardest place to do it, in Mississippi. He was moderately successful, but COFO and SNCC and Moses understood that their freedom schools would only trickle in a few voters here, a few voters there. They needed to do something dramatic. And in 1964, they set up what they called Freedom Summer, which was a campaign in which white college students were invited to come to Mississippi, learn how to help people register to vote, learn how to run these freedom schools, go through training for the various things they would have to encounter and the jobs they were supposed to do, and then volunteer for a summer to assist in helping blacks gain voting rights in Mississippi. Now, this is part and parcel of the student movement. The free speech movement had been inaugurated, or was inaugurated immediately after this. Students were feeling very activist, and the civil rights movement was a place where students in the North and in colleges in the South felt like they could put some effort. So Freedom Summer, lasting from 10 weeks from June through August of 1964 in Mississippi, had more than 1,000 volunteers, 90% of whom were white kids from the North. They were to conduct freedom schools and work with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, to help people register to vote. The most dramatic incident, something that no one wanted to happen, but that everybody knew would happen, was that on the very first day in which these three young men were sent to do the work, after having a few days, about a week's worth of training, they went out to investigate a church burning. They were arrested and subsequently released in the middle of the night and finally assassinated by parties who subsequently became known. And this is the incident on June 21st, 1964, of the murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. This is the case that is memorialized in the movie Mississippi Burning. Well, the FBI was very slow to investigate this, in part because the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who you might remember from our discussion of the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920, and the investigations into anarchists, also believed that civil rights workers kind of deserved what they got. And so he was slow to investigate. But eventually the FBI investigated. In September, they found the bodies under an earthen dam. And 10 Klansmen were tried under the old 1870 Force Act in 1967, 3 years afterwards. They were found in violation of these three men's civil rights because there is no federal statute against murder. 7 were convicted, 3 were acquitted, but the case was reopened in 2005 when new evidence came to light about those 3 acquittals, and other people have subsequently been convicted for murder in state trials. The state did try these 10 Klansmen, but found them all not guilty of murder or any other crime. So that's when the feds got involved in it. So the Mississippi Freedom Summer was not really a success, but it did bring the nation's attention to the problems of getting people registered to vote in Mississippi and the kind of oppression that was going on there. But it's Selma in 1965 and the Selma to Montgomery March of March of 1965, that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The Freedom Summer drew attention, but did not lead to the passage of any acts. But in Selma, we see a different situation. The voter registration campaign had begun in West Alabama in January of 1965 by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As a result of some of the protests in West Alabama and some of the attempts to register, this man you see here, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was attempting to intervene in a police beating of his mother, was subsequently shot. He died on February 26th of 1965, and that was the catalyst for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to stop trying to register voters and attempt to do something big and dramatic. Now, there had been within the civil rights movement, within this movement of various organizations, there had been agitation, particularly by James Farmer and his wife Diane Farmer, who was from Fisk University, to do something big for voting rights, to have a march in which the marchers would present a petition to the governor of Alabama to obey federal law. That's what this whole Selma movement was ostensibly about, was to deliver a petition to Governor George Wallace of Alabama in the state capital of Montgomery to hand deliver it, asking that he abide by federal law and allow the registration of African Americans without undue interference. Well, the catalyst for the actual march was this killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson. Now, no one was the state trooper who killed Jimmy Lee Jackson claimed self-defense. He was not arrested. Eventually, however, in I think 2011 or 2012, he was retried, convicted of manslaughter, served 6 months in prison. But on Sunday, March 7th, African Americans and their white supporters had gathered in Selma and began to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which crossed the Alabama River at this antebellum town of Selma, the seat of Dallas County and kind of the Birmingham of slightly west of Birmingham, a very segregated city and kind of the largest city in West Alabama outside of Tuscaloosa. The march was supposed to go 54 miles from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, but it didn't get anywhere really quick. On March 7th, police under state troopers under their commandant Al Lingo and local sheriff's deputies, including a posse immediately deputized by the local sheriff, then attacked marchers as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, drove them back, and of course they did this in front of television and news people. And so we have a lot of photographs of this and a lot of film footage of unprovoked attacks by authorities on people who seemingly just wanted to gain the right to vote. Eventually, after a couple of other false starts, the march took place beginning on February 21st of 1965, and it took about 4 days, ending on March 25th, to get to Montgomery. When the marchers got into Montgomery, 25,000 people joined them for the route through Montgomery to the state capitol. They were unable to actually get to the state capitol. They were stopped about half a block away from the state capitol at the head of Dexter Avenue, right before they reached the Capitol grounds. George Wallace, it said, went up into the rotunda so he could not be found in his office and he could watch the proceedings. Anyway, this dramatic march led 54 miles, led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So let's look here at a couple of photographs. On the right, you can see the attack that occurred on Sunday, March 7th, and on the left, you can see the Sunday, March 21st beginnings of the march, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge over the Alabama River. This march was protected by federal troops and by federalized National Guardsmen. There's a trail now called the Selma to Montgomery Trail that follows Highway 80. Now, at the end of this, there's another martyr to the civil rights movement, Violet Liuzzo, who was driving marchers back to Selma from Montgomery and was pulled over by Klansmen and murdered, dragged from her car and murdered. One of the Klansmen was an FBI informant. There's now a marker on a hillside next to Highway 80 at approximately the spot where her car was pulled over. Well, then what laws were passed? Well, remember I said that there had been a Civil Rights Act passed in 1957 under Eisenhower. This is quite true. It had no teeth. However, the 1964 Civil Rights Act did have enforcement mechanisms built into it, and it banned and enforced the ban on discrimination in public accommodations, in schools, and in employment. Now, interestingly enough, Southern Democrats, hoping to poison the bill, threw in gender as one of the protected categories. And when the bill passed, instead of poisoning the bill, they created gender equality too, quite by accident. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes race and gender protected classes in a ban on discrimination in public accommodations, in public schools, and in employment. Then the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution passed and was ratified in 1964 that banned literacy tests and poll taxes of all kinds. Finally, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed after the Selma to Montgomery March. It was a mechanism to enforce the 24th Amendment, and it led to the Department of Justice, in addition to many other things, having to approve redistricting and changes in voting laws that might sneak discrimination back in. This applied to states that had a history of discrimination. It applied mostly to states in the South, but also to Arizona. Okay, so we've looked at education, public accommodations, and now voting rights. We looked at two significant segments of the movement for civil rights and for voting rights, with the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964 and with the Selma to Montgomery March in Alabama of 1965. This led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which enforced the 24th Amendment and was a companion act to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the act proposed by Kennedy in 1963, but it took until 1964 to pass. Thank you, as always, for your attention.